The goblet left her hand before she even understood she'd been pushed. Wine arced through torchlight, a long red ribbon unspooling across 12 feet of marble, and Mira watched it happen the way you watch a cup fall from a high shelf. Too slow, too clear. Every second stretched thin enough to see through. She heard the gasp before she felt the impact. 300 nobles, 200 wolves in their formal second skins, the entire assembled might of the Crimson Pack pulling one collective breath inward like the hall itself had been struck in the chest. Then the wine hit him. It bloomed across the white ceremonial furs draped over his shoulders, the furs that had been blessed that morning, the furs no hand but the high priestess's was supposed to touch before the new moon, and it spread like something alive, like a wound opening in snow. Mira's knees hit the floor before she told them to. "Forgive me." The words came out cracked, barely sound at all. Behind her, Lord Cassian Thorne was already smoothing his sleeve where her shoulder had clipped him, already arranging his face into something appalled and blameless. He smelled of cedar oil and old money, and underneath that, faint as a held laugh, the bright copper tang of satisfaction. He had wanted this. She understood that with the clean, useless clarity of someone who has already lost. The newly crowned Alpha King of the Crimson Pack stood very still. He did not look down at the ruins spreading across his chest. He looked at her. Mira had spent 6 years in this hall serving wine to people who never once asked her name. And in 6 years she had learned exactly one rule that kept a girl breathing. Never let an alpha smell your fear, because fear on a wolf's tongue tastes like permission. So she knelt there with wine soaking into the knees of her uniform and tried to flatten the thunder of her pulse, tried to breathe slow, tried to be smoke instead of meat. It didn't work. She felt it didn't work. She felt the moment her scent betrayed her, sharp and citrus bitter, fear cutting clean through the room's heavy mix of incense and old wine and too many bodies pressed close, because something in his face changed. Not anger, something quieter, and somehow worse, because she couldn't name it. The master of ceremonies, a narrow man named Halvard Pym, who had served 3 Alpha Kings and buried his nerves so deep they only showed in the way he straightened his sash every few minutes, stepped forward with his hand already lifting. A signal. The kind of signal that brought guards. The kind of signal Mira had seen given exactly once before, for a man who'd insulted the old king's mate in front of his own pack. "Your Majesty." Halvard's voice did not shake. His hand did. "Say the word." The hall held its breath. Mira had grown up on stories about Alpha Kings. Every pup in the lower city had. Stories about claws that could open a man from throat to navel in a single stroke. About kings who broke jaws for the crime of spilled tea. She had served 3 coronations from the kitchen door before tonight, and watched, from a careful distance, the particular violence that power did to ordinary men once you put a crown on it. She had told herself she understood exactly what kind of animal stood at the top of a room like this. She was 30 seconds from finding out she'd been wrong. The king. And she would learn his name properly later, though right now he was only a wall of white fur gone red, only a jaw carved from something that didn't bend. Crouched. Not toward her throat. Toward her hands. He took the trembling things in his own, broad, scarred, warm in a way she hadn't expected heat to feel like, considering everything she'd heard about wolves and fire, and he turned them over like he was checking for a wound. His thumb brushed the inside of her wrist where her pulse hammered loud enough she was sure the whole hall could hear it, could probably smell the lightning strike spike of it, the way scent told truth before words ever got the chance. "Are you burned?" he asked. Not "are you sorry?" Not "how dare you?" Are you burned? Because the wine had come straight from the warming kettle, she realized distantly, hot enough to blister, and somewhere in the chaos of the fall she hadn't even registered the sting against her own skin where it had splashed her forearm. The hall did not breathe. Halvard's hand, still lifted for guards that would not come, hung suspended in the torchlit air like a man forgetting how his own arm worked. "No," Mira managed. "No, Your Majesty." He studied her face like he was reading something written in a language only he knew, head tilted slightly, nostrils flaring once. And she understood, with the particular shame of a girl who'd spent her whole life invisible, suddenly being seen too closely, that he was scenting her. Reading the fear, yes, but under it, something else. Something her body knew before her mind caught up. "Good," he said. Then he stood, wine dripping from the ruined furs onto the white marble floor in fat red drops, and he turned to address 300 nobles who had come to watch a coronation, and instead got something none of them would ever be able to explain to their grandchildren. "This hall," the king said, voice pitched to carry without shouting, the particular trick of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed, "has just watched a girl get shoved to the floor by a man twice her size, and your only concern is the state of my coat." Lord Cassian Thorne's face went the color of old parchment. "Your Majesty, the girl was clumsy, I didn't ask you to speak." The king didn't even turn his head. "I noticed you didn't help her up." Mira, still on her knees, still soaked, still shaking, felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with fear at all. She did not yet know his name was Cale Ashvane, last of a bloodline that had ruled the Crimson Pack for 400 years, or that he had been crowned exactly 11 minutes before her goblet found his chest. She did not know that he'd spent every one of those 11 minutes feeling like the furs were a costume someone had dressed him in for a play he hadn't agreed to perform. She did not know, could not have known, not yet, not from a kneeling position with wine soaking through her stockings, that the moment her scent had hit him, sharp with fear and something underneath it he hadn't let himself name, something in his chest had gone very, very quiet, the way a struck bell goes quiet. After, all she knew was that the most powerful wolf in the realm had knelt for her, in front of everyone, and asked if she was hurt. That was the moment the title of this story started to mean something. Not the wine, not the gasp, not the held breath of 300 nobles bracing for blood. The moment a king looked at a serving girl on her knees and decided, in front of his entire assembled pack, that her pain mattered more than his pride. The hall would talk about it for years. Mira would feel the weight of his hands on hers for far longer than that. But right now, kneeling in spilled wine with her heart trying to climb out through her throat, all she could think was, "He smells like cedar smoke, and something underneath it. Something that isn't quite grief and isn't quite hunger. Something I don't have a word for yet." She would learn the word eventually. It would cost them both more than either expected. Halvard Pym recovered his composure first, because recovering composure was, after 30 years of service, the only skill he genuinely trusted himself with. He cleared his throat, a sound like gravel settling, and straightened his sash for the 3rd time in 2 minutes. "Your Majesty, the girl should be removed for questioning regardless. Procedure." "Procedure," Cale said, "can wait until I've finished my coronation." He extended a hand to Mira. Just that. A king's hand, scarred across 2 knuckles in a way that told its own story, offered to a serving girl on the floor of his own coronation hall, in front of every noble house that mattered in the Crimson Territories. She stared at it like it might be a test she'd fail simply by touching it. "Take it," he said, low enough that it landed only for her. Not a command. Something gentler, and somehow that was worse, because commands she knew how to survive. Mira put her hand in his. The current that ran up her arm at the contact wasn't metaphor. She felt it the way you feel a held note. That low golden hum that wolves spoke about in old songs and that she'd always assumed, like most lower city girls, was a story made up to sell ribbons at the mating festivals. Bond recognition. The thing that supposedly happened once in 10,000 wolves, between two souls some ancient magic had decided belonged together before either of them had a say in it. It did not happen to serving girls. It especially did not happen to serving girls and alpha kings. She watched his face when it hit him too. Watched the king's jaw lock. Watched something flare gold at the edges of his irises before he blinked it away. Watched a man who had just been handed an entire kingdom look, for exactly 1/2 of 1 second, like he'd rather be handed nothing at all. Then the gold was gone, banked down like a coal someone had deliberately smothered, and his expression closed like a door. "Get her dry clothes," he said to the room at large, releasing her hand the moment she was steady on her feet. "And get me a coat that isn't ruined. We have a coronation to finish." He turned away from her before she could say anything. That was the second thing Mira learned about Kale Ashvane that night, after she learned that he knelt for the wounded instead of punishing them. He could feel exactly what she felt, the bond pull, the unmistakable golden thread of it. And he had decided, in the space of a single breath, to pretend it hadn't happened at all. That should have ended things right there. A king who denies the bond in front of his own court is a king who intends to keep denying it. Mira had heard enough kitchen gossip over the years to know that fated mates got rejected all the time, that royal houses arranged marriages decades in advance and didn't care what some ancient magic thought about it, that the songs lied about happy endings more often than they told the truth. She told herself this while a steward hustled her out a side door into a narrow servants' corridor that smelled of beeswax candles and old stone. She told herself this while she changed out of her wine-soaked uniform into a spare one 2 sizes too large. She told herself this while her hands, which had been perfectly steady serving wine to murderous nobles for 6 straight years, would not stop shaking. Kyle Ashvane stood at the center of his own coronation in a borrowed coat that didn't fit right across the shoulders, and felt, for the first time in 11 minutes of kingship, something other than the cold, leaden weight of obligation. He felt terrified, not of the assembled lords watching him with their careful, calculating eyes. He'd been trained from birth to be unafraid of lords, the way you train a wolf not to flinch at thunder. Not of the crown itself. 400 years of bloodline pressing down through gold and old magic onto a head that had never asked for it. He had buried his father 6 weeks ago and had not slept a full night since, and he had thought that was the worst thing this month could give him. Then a serving girl with wine-soaked hands and a heartbeat like a war drum had knelt in front of him, and the bond had snapped into place like a lock turning, and he had felt the entire architecture of his carefully planned life groan under the weight of one inconvenient truth. He was promised to Lyra Veshtain, had been promised since both of them were children too young to understand what a treaty meant, a binding negotiated by his father and her father to weld 2 of the largest packs in the realm into one unbroken line of succession. The wedding was 8 weeks away. The contracts were signed. The Veshtain Pack's army, 11,000 wolves strong, was the only thing standing between the Crimson Territories and the wasteland incursions creeping down from the north border, where something had been chewing through the warding stones for the better part of a year, and nobody yet knew what. A bondmate was a fairy tale his mother used to tell him before she died. A treaty was the difference between his people eating through winter or starving. He knew which one a king was supposed to choose. He told himself this while he finished the coronation rites with his voice steady and his hands clasped behind his back, where no one could see them, not quite stop trembling. He told himself this while 300 nobles knelt to him in turn, and he accepted their fealty with the correct words in the correct order. Every syllable drilled into him since he was old enough to stand. He told himself this, and underneath the telling, low and gold and patient as a fire banked for the night, the bond simply waited. It did not argue. It did not need to. It already knew something he wasn't ready to admit. Some debts don't care what a man decides he owes. She didn't see him again for 3 days, and in those 3 days, Mira learned the second rule that kept a serving girl alive in a royal household. Gossip moves faster than royal decree, and gossip had already decided exactly what had happened in that hall. "They say he's going to have you killed quietly," said Tamsin, who scrubbed pots in the kitchen 2 stations down and had a laugh like a creaking door, the kind of sound you either loved or hated depending on the day. Quiet enough nobody connects it to him being soft in front of the court. "They say the opposite," said old Bridget, who ran the lower kitchens with a wooden spoon she'd been threatening people with for 40 years and had never once actually used. "They say he asked the healers about you, by name, Mira, scrubbing wine stains out of linen that would never fully come clean, said nothing to either rumor, because saying anything felt like inviting the bond pull to surface in her voice, and she did not trust her own voice around that particular truth yet. She had not told anyone what she'd felt when he took her hand. She told herself it didn't matter. Bond recognition happened to thousands of wolves every year, and most of them never acted on it. Packs had politics. Packs had treaties. Packs had 1,000 reasons more practical than magic to decide who married whom. She had grown up watching her own mother love a man the bond had never chosen for her, watching that love be steady and good and entirely sufficient. And she had decided a long time ago that fate was a story for girls who could afford to wait for it. She was a serving girl. She poured wine. She did not get fated mates, especially not ones already promised to the daughter of an army 11,000 strong. On the 3rd night, a guard came to the lower kitchens and told her the king required her presence. Bridget's wooden spoon clattered to the floor. The room they brought her to wasn't a throne room or a court chamber. It was small, private, lined with books that smelled of leather and pipe smoke, a single fire burning low in the grate. Kyle Ashvane stood at the window with his back to the door, and when she entered he didn't turn immediately, just stayed there with one hand braced against the stone sill like he was holding something up that wanted to fall. "You wanted to see me," Mira said, when the silence stretched past what felt survivable. "My lord." "You don't have to call me that. Not here." "What should I call you then?" He turned then, and the firelight did something to his face she hadn't expected, softened the hard lines of it, made him look less like a king and more like a man who hadn't slept properly in longer than he'd admit. There was a scar through his left eyebrow, thin and old, the kind you only got from claws, not blades. She would learn later that he'd gotten it at 9 years old, defending a younger cousin from an older boy twice his size, and that he still flinched, very slightly, whenever anyone reached toward his face too fast. "Kale," he said. "Just Kale. For 5 minutes if you'll let me have that." "That's not really mine to give or withhold." "No," he agreed. "But ask me anyway, and I'll feel like a person instead of a crown for the length of the conversation." She studied him. The white furs were gone, replaced with simple dark wool, the kind of clothing that could belong to any wolf in the city, and felt something in her chest loosen slightly, the way a held breath finally lets go. "Why did you call me here?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Because 3 days ago a noble shoved a serving girl hard enough to spill wine across my coronation, and I have spent 3 days asking myself why I cared more about her wrist than my own furs, and I don't have an answer that doesn't terrify me." "That's not an answer." "No," he said again. It isn't. He crossed the room, not fast, not slow, the deliberate pace of a man choosing each step, and stopped close enough that she caught the smell of him properly for the first time without fear scrambling her senses. Cedar smoke, yes, and underneath it something warmer, something like the inside of a chimney on the first cold night of autumn. Wood smoke and old paper and, fainter still, grief. Grief had a scent. She'd learned that young, watching her own mother's face the year her father died. It smelled like rain on hot stone. Cailashvein smelled like rain on hot stone underneath all the cedar and warmth, and she understood, with a lurch, that whatever else this man was, he was also still mourning someone. You felt it too, he said. Not a question either. Felt what? She made herself say it like she didn't know. Mira. Her name in his mouth did something to her spine she wasn't prepared for. I know your name. I asked the healers. I know you've worked in this household 6 years, that your mother died of fever 2 winters ago, that you have a younger brother apprenticed to a blacksmith 3 streets from the lower market. I know all of that because I have spent 3 days trying to find a reason this isn't real, and I haven't found one. Her throat went tight. You shouldn't know any of that. I shouldn't feel any of what I feel when you're in a room, he said. And yet. The fire popped, sending up a small shower of sparks, and in the gap of silence that followed, Mira understood she was standing closer to the truth of her own life than she had ever stood before, and that she had exactly one choice about what to do with it: lean in or step back. She stepped back. You're promised to someone, she said. Lady Veshtain. The whole city knows it. The wedding's in 8 weeks. Something crossed his face. Not surprise that she knew, but pain that she'd said it first, like he'd hoped to be the one to bring it into the room gently, and she'd thrown the door open instead. Yes, he said. Then there's nothing to talk about. Mira, you're a king. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was its own small victory. I pour wine. The bond doesn't change either of those facts, and I'd rather you tell me that plainly now than let me hope for something that costs me more than it costs you. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone rough at the edges, like something scraped raw. It would cost me everything, he said. That's the part nobody tells you about the bond in the songs. They make it sound like a gift. Nobody warns you it might be the most expensive thing you ever feel. Then maybe don't feel it. I've tried, he said, and the honesty in it landed like a slap, gentler than the one Cassian Thorne had given her shoulder, but somehow harder to recover from. 3 days, Mira. I've tried for 3 days. She left without answering because she didn't trust what would come out of her mouth if she stayed in that room with him 1 more minute, breathing in rain on hot stone and cedar smoke, and the particular ache of a man who wanted something he'd already decided he couldn't have. Cale watched the door close behind her, and did not move for a long time. He had rehearsed a dozen versions of that conversation in his head over 3 sleepless nights, and in every version he had imagined himself being the strong one, the one who explained the treaty and the army and the wasteland incursions with calm, kingly clarity, and let her walk away understanding rather than hurt. Instead, she had walked away first, and he was the one standing in an empty room feeling like something had been taken out of his chest with a blunt knife. He thought of his father, 6 weeks dead, who had told him on his deathbed, voice thin as paper, hand gripping Cale's wrist with a strength that had surprised them both, that a king's first duty was to his pack, and his second duty was to bury his own wanting so deep no one, including himself, could find it again. His father had done that. His father had married for alliance, not love, and had been, by every outward measure, a good king and a fair husband, and had died with a particular hollowness in his eyes that Cale had spent his whole childhood trying not to notice. He did not want that hollowness. He had felt it cracking open in himself the moment Mira's bond scent hit him in that Coronation Hall. Gold and citrus bright even under the fear, and some old animal part of him had recognized it the way you recognize your own name spoken in a crowded room. But 11,000 soldiers stood between his people and whatever was eating through the northern wards, and he had buried a father who'd taught him that wanting was a luxury kings could not afford. He told himself he would let her go. He told himself this while his chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with grief for his father at all. The forced proximity that would change everything arrived 4 days later, and it had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with poison. Mira was carrying a tray of evening wine through the upper corridor, back on duty, because Bridget had insisted that hiding in the kitchens only made the rumors worse, when she heard a commotion from the king's private dining chamber. Raised voices, a chair scraping hard against stone, and underneath it all, a smell that made every hair on her arms rise before her mind caught up to why. Bitter almond, faint as a whisper, threaded through the rich smell of roasted venison and red wine. She had grown up in a household where her mother cleaned for an apothecary on her days off, and her mother had taught her, young and serious, the smell of nightroot poison, because nightroot grew wild in the hedgerows near their cottage, and a curious child eating the wrong berry could die before sundown. She dropped the tray. "Don't drink it!" The words tore out of her before propriety or rank, or any sense of self-preservation could stop them, and she was already moving, already shoving past a guard twice her size to reach the table where Cale sat with a goblet halfway to his lips, 3 council lords watching with the particular blankness of men trying to look innocent. He froze with the cup an inch from his mouth. "There's nightroot in it," she said. "I can smell it." The room went very still. One of the council lords, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, the kind of man who looked like he'd spent his whole life behind a desk and resented every minute of it, laughed, sharp and disbelieving. "A serving girl smells poison through a glass of spiced wine? Your Majesty, this is theater." "Test it," Cale said, without taking his eyes off Mira. "Now." They tested it. The royal physician, summoned at a run, dipped a strip of silver-treated parchment into the wine and watched it bloom a slow, sickly green. The unmistakable signature of nightroot extract, enough in that single cup to stop a grown wolf's heart inside 20 minutes. The hall, smaller this time, just a dining chamber, just 4 lords and a king and a serving girl who'd just saved his life, went so quiet Mira could hear her own pulse hammering against her ribs. "How?" Cale said slowly, setting the cup down with a hand that was, for the first time since she'd met him, visibly unsteady. "Did you know that?" "My mother taught me. Nightroot. It's bitter almond under the wine, but only if you know to look for it specifically, underneath everything else." She realized her own hands were shaking now too, the adrenaline catching up. "I didn't mean to shout at a king." "You saved a king's life," he said. "Shout however you like." The thin lord with ink-stained fingers, his name, she would learn, was Edric Voss, and he had a habit of clicking his signet ring against the table when he was thinking, a small, obsessive tick that drove everyone around him slowly mad, cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, surely this requires investigation. Someone in this room arranged that wine." "Yes," Cale said, voice gone flat and cold in a way Mira hadn't heard from him before, the sound of a king instead of a man. "It does." He looked around the table at his 3 council lords, each of them carefully arranging their faces into shock, into outrage, into the practiced innocence of men who had spent their whole lives learning how to lie in rooms exactly like this one. "Until I know which of you it was," he said. "I'm afraid you're all under suspicion, and I find I no longer trust my own kitchens, or my own table, or apparently my own counsel." He turned to Mira. "You'll taste my food from now on, officially, as royal taster, under guard protection, reporting only to me." Mira's stomach dropped. "Your Majesty, I'm a serving girl. I'm not trained for—" "You just identified a poison 3 trained physicians missed for the better part of an hour," he said. "I think you're exactly trained for it." It wasn't romance. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was duty wearing the shape of necessity. A king protecting himself the only way he had left after someone in his own household had tried to kill him on the 4th day of his reign. And it meant Mira would be at his side. Every meal. Every day. Close enough to read every flicker of scent that crossed his face. Close enough that the bond between them would have no choice but to keep tightening whether either of them chose it or not. She understood, watching his jaw work as he dismissed his counsel with a wave that brooked no argument, that he'd done it on purpose. Not the poisoning, but the assignment. He could have chosen any taster in the household. He had chosen the one woman in the entire kingdom he'd spent 3 days trying to convince himself to stay away from. "You didn't have to pick me," she said, once the room had emptied, and it was just the 2 of them and the ruined goblet of wine between them on the table. "No," he agreed. "I didn't." "Then why?" "Because you're the only person in this castle who's proven, twice now, that you'd rather tell me an inconvenient truth than protect yourself with silence." He met her eyes. "I need that more than I need distance from you right now. Even if the distance would be safer for both of us." It was. She would understand much later. The first time he'd admitted out loud that distance from her cost him something. The weeks that followed built themselves into a rhythm Mira hadn't expected to find herself inside. Every meal, she stood half a step behind his chair and tasted whatever was placed in front of him first, reading the wine and the meat and the bread for anything wrong before he so much as lifted a fork. It should have been clinical. It should have stayed a duty, a job, a careful professional distance maintained by guards at the door, and council lords watching every interaction for impropriety. Instead, it became the only part of her day she found herself waiting for. She learned things about him that no one else in the castle seemed to know, because no one else stood close enough, often enough to notice. He hated the smell of saffron, would go faintly green at the edges of his composure whenever it appeared in a dish, and never explained why until one evening, 3 weeks in, when he admitted, quietly, like the words cost him, that his mother had worn a saffron perfume, and she had died when he was 12, and the smell still felt like grief walking into the room uninvited. She learned he ate fast when he was anxious and slow when he was content, that he had a habit of turning his father's old signet ring around his finger, 3 full rotations whenever a council meeting went badly, that he genuinely, unguardedly loved bad jokes, the worse the better, and that the sound of his real laugh, the one he almost never let anyone hear, was rough and surprised, like it caught even him off guard. He learned things about her too, that she hummed without realizing it when she was concentrating, an old habit from childhood her mother used to tease her about, that she flinched, very slightly, at sudden loud noises, a holdover from a father who died in a logging accident, the crack of falling timber burned into some old animal part of her memory, that she had a flaw she didn't recognize as a flaw at all. She gave people the benefit of every doubt, every time, past the point where doubt had earned anything, and it had cost her more than once. Most recently with a kitchen boy 2 years back who'd stolen from the larder and let her take the blame, and she'd forgiven him before she'd even finished crying about it. "You do that," Cale said one evening, 3 months into the arrangement, watching her excuse Lord Cassian Thorne's continued sneering presence in the hall with some charitable explanation about grief or pressure or family expectation. You find the kindest possible reason for why someone hurt you. Is that wrong? It's going to get you killed one day if you do it to the wrong person. His voice had an edge she didn't recognize. Not anger at her, she realized, but fear for her. Cassian Thorne didn't shove you by accident, Mira. I've had him watched. He's been positioning himself against the throne since before my father died, and he needed chaos at my coronation to make a point to the other houses about how easily a king's authority spills. The wine in her hands went suddenly heavy. You think he planned it. The shove. I think a man who'd plan that would also be capable of planning a great deal worse, Cale said. And I think your instinct to forgive him for it is the exact instinct he's counting on. It was the first crack in the story she'd told herself since that night. That the spill had been an accident of crowded space and bad luck. That the world's cruelty toward serving girls was incidental rather than aimed. She did not want to believe a man could hate her enough, specifically her, an invisible girl who poured wine, to engineer a public humiliation just to wound a king through her. She would learn before this was over exactly how wrong her kindness had been. The almost moments built the way weather builds before a storm. Pressure accumulating in small, deniable increments until the air itself felt unbearable to breathe. There was the evening she reached to refill his cup, and her fingers brushed his where he held it, and neither of them pulled away for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds that felt longer than the whole rest of the meal, before Edric Voss's signet ring clicked against the table, and the spell broke, and they both reached for conversation, like drowning men reach for driftwood. There was the afternoon she found him alone in the library, with his father's old letters spread across the desk. His shoulders curved in around himself, in a way she'd never seen a king allow. And she'd sat down across from him without being asked, and simply stayed, saying nothing, until he finally spoke and told her his father's last words had been an apology for never once telling him he loved him, until it was too late to mean anything but grief. There was the night of the harvest banquet, 6 weeks into the arrangement, when Lyra Veshtain arrived early for the wedding preparations. Golden-haired, golden-eyed, the kind of beautiful that came with 11,000 soldiers attached to it. And Mira watched from her position at Cale's shoulder, as Lyra laughed at something he said, and rested a possessive hand on his forearm, and felt something hot and humiliating twist low in her own chest that she had absolutely no right to feel. Cale's eyes found hers over Lyra's shoulder, and what passed across his face wasn't comfort, wasn't apology. It was something closer to panic. The look of a man watching 2 halves of his life collide and realizing, too late, that there was no version of the evening that ended without someone getting hurt. "You're staring," Lyra said to him, following his gaze, and turned to look at Mira with the easy, dangerous curiosity of a woman who had never once in her life had to wonder whether she was wanted. "Your taster. How interesting." "She's very good at her job," Cale said, and the careful flatness in his voice was worse than any lie would have been, because Mira understood exactly what he was doing, protecting her by making her sound like furniture, and the protection cut deeper than the danger would have. Mira excused herself before the banquet ended, walked the long way back to the servants' quarters through the cold outer courtyard, and let herself, for exactly 4 minutes, cry about a man who was never going to be hers, and a bond that didn't seem to care what either of them had decided was possible. Then she wiped her face, squared her shoulders, and went back to work. Because that was the other thing 6 years of invisibility had taught her. The world did not stop turning to accommodate a serving girl's broken heart, and she had never once expected it to. Kyle found her an hour later in the empty kitchen, scrubbing a pot that didn't need scrubbing, her movements too sharp and too fast to be about the pot at all. "I shouldn't have called you that," he said, Just my taster. In front of her. You're allowed to call me what I am. That's not what I meant, and you know it. He crossed the kitchen, and for the first time since the dining room poisoning, he closed the distance between them without an excuse. No duty, no danger. Nothing but the simple, terrifying fact of wanting to be near her. I watched you leave the banquet and I felt like something had been cut out of my chest, and I had to sit there for another hour pretending I didn't notice. You're getting married in 6 weeks, Kyle. Saying his name without the title felt like jumping off something high. I can't keep doing this, standing close enough to feel everything and far enough to have nothing. I know. His jaw worked, the old scar through his eyebrow catching the low kitchen firelight. I know, and I hate that I know it, and I still don't know how to stop wanting you anyway. Then maybe that's your answer. Her voice cracked on the last word, betraying everything she'd been trying to keep flat and controlled. Maybe you don't get to keep both, the crown and the bond. Maybe you actually have to choose. He didn't answer. He looked at her like the question had landed somewhere he hadn't let himself look yet, somewhere underneath the 11,000 soldiers and the dead father and the duty drilled into him since birth. And for a moment, just a moment, she thought he might actually say something true. Then a guard's voice called from the corridor, urgent, and the moment closed like a fist. Your Majesty, the northern border. Riders just came in. Cale's face changed instantly, king replacing man in the space of a single breath. What happened? The wards broke, sir. Something came through. The thing that had been chewing through the northern warding stones for the better part of a year finally broke through 3 days later, and it turned out to be worse than anyone had let themselves imagine. A pack of rogue wolves, feral and bond-broken, infected with something the old healers called the hollow sickness. A corruption that stripped a wolf of pack bond entirely, left them running on pure animal hunger with none of the restraint the bond usually provided. 43 border villagers dead before the Crimson Pack's own forces arrived. 11,000 Veshtane soldiers nowhere near ready to deploy, because the treaty wedding hadn't happened yet, because the alliance that would have bound their armies together legally and magically wasn't sealed, because... Mira understood with cold, sick clarity. Listening at the edge of the war council she had no business attending but had been ordered to taste wine for anyway. Cale's entire kingdom's survival genuinely did hinge on that marriage happening on schedule. She watched him absorb the casualty reports with his face gone the color of old ash. Watched his hands flatten against the war table like he was trying to hold the whole map down by force, and understood that whatever she wanted, whatever the bond wanted, none of it weighed anything against 43 dead villagers and the threat of more. We need the Veshtane forces mobilized within the month, General Aldrich Corin said, a barrel-chested man with a voice like gravel and a missing left ear. Lost, she would later learn, to frostbite during a winter campaign decades ago, a wound he wore without shame or explanation, simply a fact of him. That means the wedding moves up. 2 weeks, not 6. 2 weeks, Cale repeated, and something in his voice had gone very far away. The realm needs the alliance sealed, Your Majesty. The bond magic and the marriage rite is the fastest way to legally merge command structures. Without it, we're asking 11,000 soldiers to take orders from a king they have no binding obligation to obey. Mira stood at the edge of the room with a wine flask in her hands she'd long since stopped tasting from, because nobody in that war council cared about poison anymore, and watched the man she loved. And she let herself use that word in her own head for the first time, plain and terrified and true. Get backed into a corner by 43 dead villagers and an army that wasn't his. She left before the council finished. She didn't trust her face to hold steady through the rest of it. That night, Cale came to find her in the small garden behind the eastern wing. the one place in the castle she'd claimed as hers months ago, where wild herbs grew between the formal flower beds because no gardener had bothered to weed a corner nobody important ever walked through. "I'm moving the wedding up," he said, before she could ask, before either of them could pretend the conversation wasn't already happening. 2 weeks. I know, I was there. I have to do it, Mira. His voice had the rough, scraped quality it got when he was holding something back by force. 43 people are dead. There's a sickness in the north that doesn't stop for anyone's feelings, including mine. I know that too. He stepped closer, close enough that she could read the grief and the guilt mixed in with cedar smoke and rain on hot stone, close enough that some old animal part of her wanted to close the last foot of distance between them and simply put her hands against his chest and feel his heart beating under her palms. Just once, before everything ended. "I don't want her," he said, voice cracking on it. "I want you. I have wanted you since you knelt in front of me with wine on your hands and looked terrified and furious in the same breath. And I have spent 5 months trying to convince myself that wanting isn't the same as choosing, and I don't think I believe that anymore. Cale? But I'm still going to marry her in 2 weeks," he said, "because 43 people are dead, and there will be more if I don't. And I think that makes me exactly the kind of king my father was. The kind who buries what he wants so deep he forgets where he left it. The honesty of it. The sheer, unbearable honesty. No excuses dressed up as comfort. No pretty lie to soften the landing. Hurt worse than any rejection she'd braced for since the night she first felt the bond snap into place. "Then why tell me?" she said. "Why come find me to say this instead of just letting it happen quietly? Because you deserve the truth even when the truth is something I'm ashamed of." He reached up, slow, asking permission with the movement rather than taking it, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his thumb grazing her cheekbone for one suspended second that felt like the whole world had gone quiet to make room for it. "Because I think you're the only person who's ever made me want to be a different kind of man than the one this crown is shaping me into. And I owe you the dignity of knowing that, even if I'm too much of a coward to do anything about it." She stepped back. It cost her more than anything she'd done in 5 months, but she stepped back, because staying close to that particular truth without anything she could do with it would have broken something in her she wasn't sure could be repaired. "Don't call yourself a coward," she said. "It's not cowardice to choose 43 dead villagers over your own heart. It's just not what the songs tell girls like me to hope for." She walked away before he could answer, and behind her, in the dark of the herb garden, she heard him exhale a sound that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite a sob, low and rough and entirely alone. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of Mira's life, and somewhere in the middle of them, the assumption the listener had been carrying since the opening scene cracked wide open. It started with a letter. Mira found it by accident. Not snooping. Just delivering a tray to Cale's study while he was in council. Finding him absent and the desk uncharacteristically disordered. Papers shuffled in the particular chaos of a man interrupted mid-thought. A single page sat half-covered by a ledger. His father's old seal pressed into wax at the bottom, and her eye caught a phrase before her conscience caught up to stop her. The Veshtain alliance was never about the soldiers. She read it. She knew she shouldn't have, and she read it anyway, because 6 years of invisibility had taught her that information was the only currency a serving girl ever truly owned, and some old self-protective instinct in her grabbed for it before her better nature could object. The letter was from Cale's father, written in the last weeks of his life, and it laid out something Mira hadn't expected at all. The Veshtain Treaty wasn't primarily a military alliance. It was a debt. Decades ago, during a war Mira had only heard about in old songs, The Veshtain pack had loaned the Crimson Throne an enormous sum in gold and blood magic to fund a campaign against a rival house. A debt the old king had never been able to fully repay. A debt that had quietly accrued interest in the form of a marriage contract instead of coin. Cale's father had written, with the particular bitterness of a dying man finally admitting a failure, that he had mortgaged his son's heart to cover his own mistakes. And he was sorry, and he hoped Cale would find a way to forgive him for it. The army was real. The northern threat was real. But the marriage wasn't about soldiers needing legal command structure at all. That had been Aldrich Corin's framing. A true thing used to obscure a truer thing. The marriage was about a debt Cale had inherited the way he'd inherited the crown, without ever once being asked if he wanted it. Mira set the letter down with hands that had gone cold. She had spent 2 weeks believing Cale was a king, sacrificing his heart for 43 dead villagers, and an army his people genuinely needed. That had felt, however painful, like something she could respect even while it broke her. What she was looking at now was something else. A man marrying a stranger to clean up his dead father's debts, dressed in the language of duty because duty was easier to say out loud than shame. It didn't make her love him less. It made her understand, with a clarity that hollowed her out, exactly how much weight he'd been carrying alone, and exactly how much he hadn't told her, even in his most honest moment in that garden, because some shames run too deep even for honesty to reach. She didn't confront him with it immediately. She sat with it instead, turning it over, trying to decide what a serving girl with no power and no army and nothing but a bond neither of them had asked for could possibly do with a truth this size. What Mira didn't know, what stayed hidden from her for 3 more days, the medium loop the listener had been carrying since the War Council scene, was that Lyra Veshtain didn't want this marriage any more than Cale did. Cale found that out by accident too, in a way that finally cracked something open between him and his bride-to-be that neither of them had been brave enough to say plainly until pressure forced it. It happened the night before the wedding, in a private antechamber where tradition demanded the betrothed pair share one final, unsupervised conversation before the rites bound them. Lyra stood at the window with her golden hair loose for once instead of bound in formal braids, and when she turned to face him, her composure had cracked into something Cale hadn't seen from her in 5 months of careful diplomatic interactions. "I don't want to marry you," she said, flat and exhausted. "I want you to know that before tomorrow so you don't spend the rest of your life thinking you broke something I actually wanted." Cale blinked. What?" "There's someone else." Her jaw tightened. "A wolf in my own pack's guard. Bren, we've loved each other since we were children, and my father knows, and he doesn't care, because this marriage repays a debt that matters more to him than my heart does." She laughed, short and bitter. "Apparently that's a family tradition on both sides. You knew about the debt. My father told me everything when I turned 18. Yours apparently waited until he was dying." Her eyes, gold and sharp, studied his face with something almost like sympathy. "I've watched you for 5 months, Cale Ashvane. I've watched the way you look at your taster when you think no one's paying attention. I'm not blind, and I'm not cruel enough to pretend I haven't noticed." His chest went tight. "Lyra, I'm not telling you this to hurt you," she said. "I'm telling you because tomorrow we're both about to make ourselves miserable to pay off a debt that isn't even ours. And I think that's the stupidest thing 2 grown wolves with crowns and armies could possibly do, and I'd rather say it out loud once than spend the next 40 years pretending I never thought it." Cale sat down, hard, on the edge of a velvet bench that had clearly been arranged for exactly this kind of formal, careful conversation and not at all for the one actually happening. "If we don't marry," he said slowly, "the debt goes unpaid. The alliance doesn't bind. The Northern Threat. The Northern Threat needs soldiers, not a wedding." Lyra said. My father wants the debt cleared because it's been a humiliation hanging over his house for 30 years. Not because 11,000 soldiers genuinely require a marriage contract to follow orders. That part was always theater for the council. Soldiers follow treaties. Treaties don't require vows. It was the costly, quiet thing the midpoint had been building toward, not a grand renunciation of the throne, not some sweeping gesture in front of cheering crowds, but Kale Ashvani sitting on a velvet bench the night before his own wedding, listening to the woman he was supposed to marry hand him, almost casually, the information that could unmake the entire architecture of duty he'd spent 5 months convincing himself he had no choice but to honor. What do you want? He asked her. I want to marry Bren, Lyra said. Quietly, eventually, once my father's pride has had time to recover from the broken contract. I want a debt paid in gold instead of in 2 people's hearts. And I want you, she added, to stop looking like a man walking to his own execution every time someone mentions tomorrow. My father's last letter, Kale said. He apologized for mortgaging my heart to cover his mistakes. Then maybe, Lyra said gently, don't finish paying a debt he was ashamed he made you owe. Mira learned the wedding was canceled the same way most of the castle learned it. Fast, chaotic, gossip outracing official announcement by a full hour. The kind of news that traveled kitchen to kitchen like wildfire through dry grass. She was elbow-deep in dishwater when Tamsin burst in, breathless, her perpetual creaking laugh nowhere in evidence. The wedding's off. Lady Veshtain called it off herself, in front of her own father, in front of half the visiting court. Mira's hands went still in the water. Why? She managed. Nobody knows for certain. Some say she's in love with someone else. Some say there's a debt that's been settled differently. Bridget says... Tamsin lowered her voice like the kitchen itself might be listening. Bridget says it's because the king refused to go through with it. That he stood up in front of everyone and said he couldn't marry a woman who didn't love him while loving someone else himself. Mira's heart was doing something complicated and dangerous in her chest. Hope and terror tangled too tight to separate. That's not what happened, said a voice from the kitchen doorway, and every wolf in the room, including Mira, turned to find Kale Ashvani standing there in plain dark wool. No crown, no guards visible, looking like he'd run the length of the castle to get there. The kitchen staff scattered into corners and doorways with the particular speed of people who understood, instinctively, that whatever was about to happen wasn't meant for an audience, but they weren't quite brave enough to leave entirely. What did happen? Mira asked, very quietly, drying her hands on her apron because her hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. Lyra told me she loves someone else, a guard in her own pack. She's loved him since they were children. Kale crossed the kitchen, slow, deliberate, the same way he'd crossed it the night she found him scrubbing nothing out of a clean pot. And she told me the marriage was never about soldiers needing legal command. It was about a debt my father owed her father, dressed up in duty so neither of us would ever think to question it. I know about the debt, Mira said. I read the letter. On your desk. I shouldn't have, and I did, and I'm sorry. Something crossed his face. Not anger, surprise maybe, and underneath the surprise, a kind of relief, like a secret set down after being carried too long. I'm glad you know, he said. I should have told you myself. I was ashamed of it. Ashamed my father mortgaged something that wasn't his to spend. Ashamed I let it shape every decision I made for 5 months without questioning it until someone else handed me permission to. What happens now? Mira asked. The debt, the alliance, the northern threat. The debt gets paid in gold, the way it should have been 30 years ago. The alliance gets sealed by treaty instead of marriage, because Lyra was right. Soldiers follow contracts, not vows. The northern threat gets fought with the army we already have, plus whatever the Veshtane pack sends regardless, because decent people don't let villages burn over a broken engagement. He stopped close enough that she could smell him properly. Cedar and rain on hot stone. The grief note fainter now, like something had finally been allowed to breathe. And I came to find you, because I have spent 5 months telling myself wanting wasn't the same as choosing, and I don't have an excuse left to hide behind. The kitchen had gone very quiet. Somewhere behind a half-closed pantry door, Mira was fairly sure Bridget was holding her breath loudly enough to be heard. "You should know something else first," Mira said, because honesty had cost him something tonight and she owed him the same coin. "The thing you said about me always finding the kindest reason someone hurt me. You were right. I've spent 6 years explaining away every small cruelty in this castle, because it was easier than admitting how much it cost me to be invisible. I don't want to keep doing that. Not even for you." "I'm not asking you to be invisible," Kale said. "I'm asking you to let me be seen too. All of it. The debt, the shame, the king my father wanted me to be that I'm not entirely sure I want to become. That's a lot to ask a serving girl. You stopped a poisoning with your nose and told off 3 council lords in the same breath," he said, and something warm finally cracked through the careful gravity of his voice. "I think you can handle a king with complicated feelings." She laughed, actually laughed, surprised out of herself. And the sound of it seemed to undo something in him entirely, his shoulders dropping, his whole frame loosening like a held breath finally let go. "This isn't a yes," she warned him. "This is a maybe, a very cautious maybe." "I'll take a maybe," Kale said. "I've spent 5 months getting good at wanting things I told myself I couldn't have. A maybe feels like winning." The breathing room didn't last. 3 days after the cancelled wedding, with the castle still buzzing on rumor and the official treaty negotiations underway between Crimson and Veshtane envoys, Cassian Thorne made his move. And it became clear, with brutal speed, exactly how much Mira's instinct to forgive him had cost everyone around her. It happened at a smaller gathering, a council dinner meant to smooth diplomatic feathers ruffled by the broken engagement, and Mira stood at her usual post behind Kale's chair, tasting wine before it touched his lips, when Cassian rose from his seat with a goblet of his own, raised in mock toast. "To His Majesty," Cassian said, voice carrying with practiced ease, "and to whatever replaces an army of 11,000 soldiers, now that he's traded them for a serving girl's smile." The table went tense. Edric Voss's signet ring clicked twice against the wood, fast, nervous. "That's an interesting way to describe a debt being honorably repaid," Kale said, voice even. But Mira had spent 5 months learning to read him, and she heard the danger coiled underneath the calm. "Is it dishonorable to wonder," Cassian pressed, "whether a king thinking with something other than his crown might be exactly the weakness our northern enemies are counting on? 43 villagers died, Your Majesty, while you were deciding whether you preferred a serving girl to a treaty." It was a precise cruelty, calculated to land exactly where it would do the most damage, implying Kale's heart had cost lives, implying Mira herself was the reason for it, dressing ambition up as concern for the realm the way Cassian always dressed his cruelty up as something more respectable. Mira felt the old instinct rise in her, the urge to shrink, to apologize for existing in a room where her presence had become a political weapon, to find some kind explanation for Cassian's malice, the way she'd found one for the kitchen boy who'd let her take his blame. She didn't reach for it this time. 43 villagers died because something broke through wards that should have held, she said, before Kale could speak, her voice steadier than she expected. Not because a king fell in love. If you want to find someone to blame for the timing, my lord, you might ask who's been quietly underfunding the northern garrison for the better part of a year. Because I've heard that rumor in the kitchens too. And unlike the rumor about me, that one's been verified by 3 separate stewards counting supply ledgers. The table went utterly silent. Cassian's face drained of color so fast it would have been satisfying if the room hadn't gone simultaneously, dangerously still. That's slander, he managed. It's an accounting discrepancy, Mira said. I'm sure it's nothing. Kale's hand found hers under the table, brief and fierce, and when she glanced at him, his eyes had gone bright with something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite hunger, but lived somewhere dangerous between the two. Cassian Thorne left the dinner early, claiming illness, and within 2 days, 3 separate garrison stewards confirmed independently that funds earmarked for Northern Wall reinforcement had been quietly redirected for the better part of a year, straight into accounts traced, eventually, back to Cassian's own house. He hadn't just shoved a serving girl out of spite at a coronation. He'd been actively starving the realm's northern defense for over a year, positioning himself to look indispensable when the inevitable crisis hit, hoping to maneuver his own house into greater influence over a young king, too distracted by grief and crown weight to notice the slow theft happening under his nose. The wine spill hadn't been random cruelty at all. It had been a test, Cassian gauging, in that crowded coronation hall, exactly how much chaos a new king would tolerate before cracking, exactly how easily his authority could be made to spill the same way the wine had. He had simply badly misjudged what kind of man Cale Ashvane actually was underneath the crown. The discovery should have felt like triumph, and for a single sharp evening it did. Watching Cassian Thorne arrested in front of the same council table where he'd tried to humiliate her, watching the careful mask of cedar oil and old money crack into something desperate and ugly as guards led him away. But triumph curdled fast into something heavier once Mira understood the full shape of what she'd helped uncover. 43 people, she said to Cale that night, sitting across from him in his private study. The fire burned low, both of them too exhausted for formality. They might still be alive if someone had caught this sooner. You caught it, Kyle said. Tonight, after everyone else missed it for a year. I almost didn't say anything at all. You know that, right? My first instinct was still to find him a kind explanation. Even after everything. Her voice cracked slightly on the admission. I don't know if I trust myself to keep choosing differently. Cale reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, turning it over the way he had that first night in the coronation hall, thumb brushing the inside of her wrist where her pulse still ran too fast. You said something to him before any of us knew about the garrison funds, he said. You didn't wait for proof. You trusted what you'd already learned about him being capable of cruelty, and you spoke anyway, even though every habit you have told you to find him an excuse instead. It still feels like luck. It's not luck to finally believe your own judgment over your old habit of forgiving people who don't deserve it. His thumb kept moving against her wrist, slow, grounding. I've spent 5 months watching you do that exact thing in small ways nobody else noticed. Tonight you just did it where it mattered most. She let her head tip forward, forehead nearly touching his, close enough to breathe the same air. Close enough that the bond between them felt less like a pull and more like a held note finally resolving into a chord. This is still complicated, she said. The debt, the council, what people will say about a king choosing a serving girl over an army. I know. I'm not ready to pretend that's simple. I'm not asking you to pretend anything, Cale said. I'm asking you to let it be complicated together instead of alone. That's all. That's the whole ask. She didn't pull away this time. She let her forehead rest against his, let the fire's low crackle, and his steady breathing fill the quiet between them, and for the first time since wine had spilled across white furs and changed the entire shape of her life, the silence between them felt like rest instead of waiting. The public claim, the moment the title had been promising the listener all along, arrived 2 weeks later, at the formal council session where Cale intended to announce the new Veshtain Treaty terms, the resolution of the garrison theft, and what the assembled lords of the realm were already calling, in hushed and scandalized tones, the matter of the king's taster. Mira stood at her usual place behind his chair, in the same hall where wine had once spilled across white furs in front of 300 witnesses, and felt the weight of every eye in the room the same way she had that first night. Except this time, she did not kneel, and she did not shake. Cale rose to address the assembled nobles. The white furs were gone, replaced now with deep crimson formal robes, the color of a king who'd stopped wearing his father's ceremonial choices and started making his own. The scar through his eyebrow caught the torchlight the way it always did. 5 months ago, he said, voice carrying easily through the hall. A young woman knelt in this room after being shoved hard enough to spill wine across my coat, and this hall braced itself to watch her punished for another man's cruelty. A murmur ran through the assembled lords. Mira felt her pulse climb, felt the old instinct to disappear rise hot in her throat, and made herself stand still anyway. Instead, Cale continued, I learned, in the months since, that the same woman has twice now saved my life. Once from poison her training in night route identification caught when 3 physicians missed it, and once from a slow theft of garrison funds that her willingness to speak an uncomfortable truth out loud finally exposed, after a year of better-trained men either missing it or choosing silence. Edric Voss's signet ring clicked, fast and nervous, against the council table. I am informed, Cale said, that some of you have concerns about a king's judgment when that king's heart is engaged. I understand the concern. I share it some days. His eyes found Mira's, steady, unhurried, the look of a man who had spent 5 months learning the difference between duty and cowardice, and had finally stopped confusing the two. But I would ask this hall to consider what kind of judgment actually protects a realm. A king who marries strategically and dies, like my father did, with a hollow place in his chest he never let anyone see. Or a king who chooses, with open eyes and full knowledge of the cost, the one person who has proven, twice, publicly, at real risk to herself, that she values this realm's safety over her own comfort. He stepped down from the dais, walked the same length of marble floor Mira had knelt on 5 months ago, wine soaking into her uniform, bracing for blood. He stopped in front of her now, close enough that the whole hall could see exactly what he intended, and the silence that fell was the same silence from that first night. Held breath. 300 nobles. The particular electric stillness of a room about to witness something it would talk about for years. I'm not asking this council's permission, Cale said, loud enough to carry, eyes never leaving Mira's face. I'm informing this council of my intent. I choose her. Not because the bond gave me no choice. Bonds can be ignored. My father ignored his. Plenty of wolves do. I choose her because every single day for 5 months, she has shown me exactly what kind of person I want standing beside a throne, and I am done pretending that pretending is the same thing as duty. Mira's breath had stopped somewhere in her chest. The hall held its silence. 300 faces turned toward the same point of impossible focus, and somewhere in the back of the room she heard, distinct even in the quiet, the unmistakable creak laugh of Tamsin failing to contain herself, and old Bridget's wooden spoon clattering against stone as she dropped it in shock for the second time in this story. This was the moment. The unexpected reaction the title had promised. finally laid bare in full public view. Not punishment for the girl who'd ruined a king's coronation furs. Not quiet dismissal, the kind that let a king keep his dignity while discarding an inconvenient bond. A public, decisive, unmistakable claim, made in the same hall where she'd once knelt bracing for execution, made with his full crown and council, and the weight of every watching noble house bearing witness. "You're certain?" she said, very quietly. Only for him, though half the hall probably read the shape of the words from her lips anyway. "I have never been more certain of anything since they put a crown on my head I never asked for," he said. "Mira, choose me too. Not because of the bond, because you want to." She thought of 6 years of invisibility. She thought of a goblet falling, slow and red and inevitable, and a king kneeling instead of striking. She thought of Nightroot and garrison theft, and a letter she shouldn't have read, and a woman named Lyra who'd had the courage to say an uncomfortable truth out loud at exactly the moment it mattered most. She thought of her own old habit of forgiving people who hadn't earned it, and the new, harder-won habit of trusting her own judgment instead. "Yes," she said. The hall did not stay quiet after that. It broke into something between a gasp and a roar, 300 nobles abandoning decorum entirely, and somewhere underneath the noise Mira heard Cale laugh, that rough, surprised laugh he almost never let anyone hear, caught entirely off guard by his own happiness, and felt him pull her in. Not for a kiss, not yet, just close enough that she could feel his heart hammering as hard as her own against her palm where it rested flat on his chest. "They're all staring," she murmured. "Let them," Cale said. "I spent 11 minutes as king before I knelt for you in front of all of them. Seems fitting I spend the rest of my reign making sure they remember why." They did not kiss in front of the council, though every instinct in the room seemed to expect it. 300 nobles holding their breath for a storybook ending played out in public. Cale, instead, simply turned to address the hall once more. Voice steady, the king reasserting himself even with his hand still wrapped around Mira's, and gave the order to formally seal the new Veshtain Treaty. Gold for the old debt, soldiers bound by contract instead of vow, and announced that the matter of Cassian Thorne's trial for treason and theft would proceed within the week. Business. Duty. The parts of kingship that didn't stop simply because a man's heart had finally caught up with what his bond had known for 5 months. It was, Mira would think later, exactly the kind of restraint that told her everything she needed to know about him, that he could claim her in front of his entire realm and still turn, in the very next breath, back to the work of protecting that realm, because the two things had never actually been in competition. He had simply needed 5 months and a broken engagement, and a serving girl's stubborn honesty to understand that. The real moment, the one that belonged only to them, came hours later, long after the council had dispersed into a fresh wave of gossip that would outlast every other scandal this castle had seen in a generation. Long after Tamsin had hugged her hard enough to crack a rib, and Bridget had finally retired her wooden spoon for the night with something suspiciously like tears in her eyes. Cale found Mira in the small herb garden behind the eastern wing, her sanctuary, the one corner of the castle that had always felt like hers before anything else in this story had. The night air smelled of crushed mint and cold stone, and, underneath it, faintly, the first green edge of spring trying to push through winter's last grip. "You didn't have to do that in front of the whole council," Mira said, when he settled onto the low stone bench beside her. "You could have told me privately, saved yourself the political mess." "I could have," he agreed, "but you spent 6 years being told, in 100 small, invisible ways, that you didn't matter enough to be seen. I wasn't going to choose you quietly after that. You earned loud." Her throat tightened, the good kind of tight, the kind that came before tears that didn't hurt. "I'm still a serving girl," she said. "I don't know the first thing about being whatever I'm about to become. Court politics, treaties, all of it." "Neither did I, 5 months ago," Cale said. "I knew how to recite coronation vows and accept fealty in the correct order. I didn't know how to be a king who actually deserved the title until a serving girl spilled wine on my coat and refused to let me be cruel about it." "That's a very generous way of describing me ruining your ceremonial furs." "They were itchy," Cale said, entirely deadpan, and the sheer unexpected absurdity of it broke something open in Mira, a laugh tearing free of her chest before she could stop it, helpless and bright in the quiet garden. Genuinely, 400 years of tradition, and nobody thought to ask if the white fur made the new king's neck itch unbearably for the entire ceremony. You did me a favor. I'm fairly sure that's not how the hall interpreted it at the time. "No," he said, and his voice dropped, gentling into something private and unguarded, the version of him almost no one else in the castle had ever been allowed to see. "But I knew, the second I knelt down and felt the bond settle into place, that whatever the hall thought it had witnessed, what actually happened was the first honest moment of my entire reign. Everything before that had been performance. You weren't performing anything. You were just terrified and brave at the same time, and I'd never seen anyone manage both at once before." He reached for her hand again, the same gesture from that very first night, except now there was no fear scrambling her scent, no held breath bracing for violence, just the steady, certain warmth of two people who had finally stopped pretending the bond between them was something to survive instead of something to choose. "I have one condition," Mira said, "before this goes any further. Name it. I want to keep working in the kitchens, not as a serving girl forever. I understand that's not realistic anymore, but I want to learn the running of this household properly, from the people who actually keep it alive, before anyone starts calling me a queen. I don't want to skip past everything Bridget and Tamsin and everyone like them have taught me just because a crown is about to get involved." Something in Cale's face softened further, if that was even possible at this point in the night. "That's not a condition. That's exactly the kind of king, the kind of partner I'm hoping to become because of you. Stay close to the ground. Don't let the crown make you forget what the ground feels like." "Your father forgot." "My father forgot a great many things," Cale said, quiet now, the grief note in his scent rising faint and honest for just a moment before settling. "I don't intend to repeat all of his mistakes, just possibly some new ones of my own." That's reassuring. "I never promised perfect," he said. "I promised honest. I think, between the two of us, honest gets us further anyway." She leaned into him then, finally, fully. No half measures, no careful distance maintained for propriety or duty or fear. Just the simple, overwhelming relief of letting herself want something in the open after months of wanting it in careful, guarded silence. He smelled like cedar smoke and crushed mint now, the grief note of rain on hot stone fainter than she'd ever caught it, like some old wound had finally been allowed to start closing instead of being buried deeper. "For the record," she murmured against his shoulder, "I'd pour wine on you again, if it meant getting here." "For the record," Cale said, voice rough with something that sounded dangerously close to laughter and tears both at once, "I'd let you, every single time." The garden held them in its quiet, mint and cold stone, and the first green push of spring, and somewhere above the castle the night settled into the particular stillness that comes after a storm has finally, fully passed. Not loud, not triumphant, not a fairy tale ending dressed up for an audience. Just two people, choosing each other in the dark, with no one left to perform for and nothing left to prove. That was the only ending either of them had ever actually wanted.